And this, of course, raised a big red flag to them because they had assumed and had, in good faith, purchased these crystal skulls in the late 1800s as authentic Aztec or perhaps Mayan, although now people do not think that there were very many Mayan crystal skulls, if any. But they started having serious doubts that those crystal skulls anyway were somehow authentic ancient skulls that had been carved 1,000 years ago or something like that.
Very interesting. And, I would like to pick up on a few notes that you mentioned there, especially regarding Mexico, and I'm going to return to that a bit later there. But I want to mention before that in a recent story from Archaeology, that their website is archaeology.org, I think, a story written by Jane McLaren Walsh. The title of the story was Legend of the Crystal Skulls, a fairly recent story. And basically...
I saw that article, yeah.
You did, yeah. I mean, the entire subject is basically debunked in that article. Basically, I guess they refer to this because they've done testing on a few that I would guess at this point is actually a crappy few fakes of these that kind of came onto the scene during the second half of the 19th century, and they began to surface. And of course, what they determined to be a fake is those who have clear evidence of, as you say, kind of tool marks on them. But that does not necessarily mean, though, that those are fake, because if we just take into account what you mentioned, that if indeed these people back there in South America, the Mayans, Aztecs, etc., had these kinds of tools, then it doesn't mean that it's a fake, but it's actually a real thing. So is it possible, do you think, at all to determine the age of these crystal skulls at all?
Well, I mean, that's one of the problems with crystal skulls, is that because they're carved out of quartz crystal, you cannot, there's no way to really date them unless, like, you could find the origin. If you could find the maker and even like an invoice or something to somebody saying, yeah, I made this crystal skull for you, here's your bill, blah, blah, blah. They think that these crystal skulls, like the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, the one in at the British Museum, they think now that they were made in Germany, and that they were made by there's a couple of special towns in Germany that specialize in crystal carving.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about, say, 1860 or so. This time, they did have power tools. They had diamond drills and saws. They could cut. They could polish the skulls. And yeah, that article that you're talking about by Walsh, she works for the Smithsonian Institution, and
right.
Because of this new Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull movie that's coming out, I mean, there's already an intense interest in these skulls. By the way, I mean, one of the curious things going on here in this whole debate about the crystal skulls, who made them, how authentic they are, the one in Paris, the Parisians insist that is not a modern fake. They insist that it is an Aztec crystal skull.
Mm.
So now you have the Smithsonian and the British Museum saying, no, these things are, they're not 1,000 years old or more. They're only, maybe 150 years old, something like that.
Right.
But in Paris, they're saying, no, this is really an Aztec crystal skull. If you go to museums in Mexico, you will see crystal skulls, in the museums. The main museum in Mexico City, I was just there a couple of months ago,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a great museum. Lot of cool stuff to see and unusual things.
Right.
And you will see some crystal skulls in there. They're not life-size, though. They're much smaller, just a few inches high. They are carved out of quartz crystal. I mean, we say in our book that the Aztecs probably themselves weren't able to make crystal skulls, but the Mixtecs and Zapotecs apparently were. In my book that came out last year on the mystery of the Olmecs,
Right.
I show in that book that nearly everything that is ascribed to the Mayans, whether it's the calendar, the writing system, the number system, the building the pyramids, even the ball games and the rubber balls and things like that, that all that really originated with the Olmecs. And the Olmecs apparently had a pretty high technology. When I was on your show before, we talked about my book, Technology of the Gods.
Right.
And like you were saying earlier, a lot of what that has to do with is that ancient civilizations did have, some pretty high technology, including drills. I maintain that at points they had electricity. They certainly had hardened metals. They were capable of carving very hard stones like basalt. You have in Mexico these colossal Olmec heads. They're 20 tons. They're carved out of basalt, which is extremely hard stone. Quartz crystal is harder and more difficult to carve. But yeah, so I mean, this goes back to what you were kind of saying, was the Smithsonian and the British Museum. They're basically looking at the crystal skulls, seeing that whoever carved them did have access to some very hard tools. I mean, even they say that you would need diamond-tipped tools to create these things. Well, they naturally assume that the Aztecs and the Mayans didn't have that kind of stuff. In fact, I mean, one of the weird things with the Mayans is that the Mayans were thought to really not even have normal metal tools, like as they had in South America or existed, say, in the Middle East and Europe at that time. But the Mayans didn't have those things.
Right.
They might have had some soft copper tools. The Mayans typically used obsidian and flint knives. They didn't use a lot of metals. So that causes a problem where if the Mayans didn't have metals or the tools to carve crystal and make crystal skulls, such as the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull, as an example, then who could have made these things? Well, they naturally think that they had to be modern forgeries, and there's some evidence to that, and I don't totally disagree with them that some of these crystal skulls are made somehow in Europe, perhaps actually in Mexico, but were made, in the late 1800s.
Right. Can I pick up on that? Because there was actually one very interesting thing that I thought, at least, in the archaeology or article that they brought out, and that has to do with the potential origins on some of the skulls and the connection with the French guy called Eugene Boban that was around in there.
That's right. Yeah, and we do talk about him in our book too, of course.
We do. Okay. Yeah, because this was what they had to say. I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs from the article here, and it says the first Mexican crystal skulls made their debut just before the 1863 French intervention, when Louis Napoleon's army invaded the country and installed, this is interesting, Maximilian von Habsburg of Austria as Emperor of Mexico then. 2 other examples of crystal skulls were exhibited in 1867 at the Exposition Universelle in Paris as part of the collection of Eugene Boban. Perhaps the most mysterious figure in the history of crystal skulls, a Frenchman who served as the official archaeologist of the Mexican court of Maximilian von Habsburg. And Boban was also a member of the French Scientific Commission in Mexico, whose work the Paris Exposition was designed to highlight. And the article goes on to say, one small crystal skull was purchased in 1874 for 28 pesos by Mexico City's National Museum for the Mexican collector Louis Constantino, and another for 30 pesos in 1880. In 1886, the Smithsonian bought a small crystal skull, this one from the collection of Augustine Fischer, who had been Emperor Maximilian's secretary in Mexico, but disappeared mysteriously from the collection sometime after 1973. It had been on display in the exhibition of archaeological fakes after William Fosshag, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, a Smithsonian mineralogist realized in the 1950s that it had been carved with a modern lapidary wheel. So with those paragraphs in mind, what about we entertain the idea that potentially some of the crystal skulls actually were created by, because as you say, if you were highlighted the fact that they potentially were done in Germany. So what if Maximilian von Habsburg actually brought some of those to Mexico and began to surface them around that area? Maybe not to, earn money or something because they were sold very cheaply, but maybe because they either wanted to discredit the subject of the real ones that were there, or potentially even flooding actually the market with fake skulls to actually kind of, the real ones would be kind of forgotten or lost among on all the fake ones. What do you think about that, David?
Well, right. I mean, I think you're on the right track there, and that's the way the British Museum and the Smithsonian were thinking about it. I mean, it's curious that the Paris archaeologists, are still wanting to believe that the skull they got, probably from also Eugene Boban, is really an authentic Aztec skull. What I would say, along your lines, just a little bit differently, though, is that, crystal skulls do exist in Mexico. The Aztecs did have them, the Mixtecs, the Zapotecs, probably the Olmecs before them. I mean, both the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs are basically direct descendants of the mysterious Olmecs, and the Olmecs apparently did have pretty high technology. Were able to carve basalt and crystal and stuff like that. So crystal skulls did absolutely exist, and the Mexicans have always been fascinated by them. If you go to Mexico, you'll see skull motifs everywhere. They have the whole Day of the Dead celebration, skull type of iconography, and whether ceramic and made out of stone, just painted on walls. That's very, very common down there.
Yeah.
It is said that the two countries in the world that really use the skull motif the most are Mexico and Tibet.
Right.
And you have also there are Tibetan crystal skulls, and from the Himalayas, there are collections of those as well. Again, you've got to stress that making anything out of quartz crystal, including a crystal skull, is difficult. I mean, you've chosen one of the most difficult and hard materials to try and work with.
Yeah.
The Greeks thought that quartz crystals, were a special kind of super frozen ice. But here's probably what was going on. In Mexico, and it does have a lot to do with Maximilian and the Habsburgs, the French trying to take over Mexico and run it as an empire. Mm-hmm. And there was something going on there, apparently, where crystal skulls and the authentic ones that they may have had, and the Mexican emperors, they, like crystal balls, they may have been some kind of magical oracle that priests, and including these emperors and the high officials, they may have wanted crystal skulls as talismans, symbols of power, even as some kind of occult, windows to the future to help them rule the country.